Hi, everyone. Welcome to episode 88 of the All Dolphins podcast. Before we join our guest, who you see in the picture right now, we're going to shout out to two former players, one of who I may call Mr. Dolphin, former Dolphin tight end, and then longtime voice of the Dolphins, Jim Mandich, RIP, absolutely phenomenal radio voice, radio analyst, bled aqua and orange, the passion shone through every time he was calling game. He made listening to a game on the radio absolutely awesome. The second one, and there's a tie into the Buffalo Bills, who, newsflash, the Dolphins play this week. Tight end Keith Jackson. And my little history lesson with this one here is in 1992, Keith Jackson and other players were suing the NFL to become unrestricted free agents. This is before full-blown free agency. And a judge ruled that him and three other players absolutely had the right to become free agents. The Dolphins signed Keith Jackson. The very next week, they're playing at Buffalo in week 4. Two teams are undefeated. The Dolphins kick the crap out of the Bills, 37-10. Keith Jackson has 2 touchdown receptions in that game. Also a game where Louis Oliver scored on a 103-yard touchdown interception return, I should say. So that's a little history lesson there.
We do history lessons over here. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say, Omar and I are joined today by Matt Perino, covers the Bills for the Syracuse Post-Standard, also host of the podcast Shout. Matt, welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
On your podcast, you talk what? Because Shout just covers a whole lot of areas.
So when we started the podcast, it was called Bills Talk with Matt Perino. And you can't use the team's name in the title of the podcast. So I put it out to fans to pick the name. And the Shout song, Bills Make Me Want to Shout, is synonymous with the team. So that was one of the submitted names, and we put it out for a vote, and that was what people landed on, and we've been rolling with it ever since.
All right. Well, good to hear that. We probably are in a little trouble here with alldolphins.com, Alan.
I got a cease and desist. So I just said, you know what? We'll go with a different name. And actually, Shouts worked out pretty well. Fans really enjoy that aspect of the show name.
Nice. We're thinking we're talking with either I Said What I Said or P.O. Box or Pupar and Omar. So it may change. No. So the Dolphins obviously are the talk of the NFL after the Broncos beat down, the Denver demolition, the Peyton pounding, whatever you want to call it, 70-20. So I'm curious as what's the view of the Dolphins in that game from Buffalo?
I mean, this is exactly who I thought they were going to the season. It's funny because we're a month removed from, people on national radio shows trying to peddle their New York Jets takes. And listen, I know what happened with Aaron Rodgers happened, and you can't control that thing, but I think people were kind of downplaying who the Dolphins are, who they were last year, and who I expected them to be this year. And everything that's happened through 3 weeks is, I think they're the biggest problem for the Bills winning the AFC East for a 4th consecutive year. And I think the fan base understands that, knows that well. It's so fitting. I was talking to my wife yesterday. We both grew up in Buffalo. I was a Bills fan back in the day, obviously before starting to cover the team. And so I lived through the 4 Super Bowls. And in that era, it was the Miami Dolphins that were the number 1 rival of the Bills. All this Patriots jazz that's happened over the last 2 decades, younger Bills fans don't really understand that this was the rival. So it's kind of fitting that now that the Bills are back in Super Bowl contention, that the Miami Dolphins have kind of joined them there, and both teams kind of left the Patriots in their dust.
So you're saying that the Dolphins are who you thought they were. Sorry, go ahead. Omar, you have a question?
I don't believe you. No, I know you didn't expect them to put a 50 burger win on somebody, 70 points up and a 50-point win on anybody. I know Dolphin fans didn't expect that, at least. What made you concerned about Miami out of all the AFC East teams?
The speed, consistently especially in September when weather isn't, a problem. I felt like they were going to come out and of the gates fast. I wasn't a big believer in Denver either. And I think what we saw from last week, this Washington team outside of that defensive front, I had a lot of question marks about them. This was if you go back and watch that Denver Washington game, both those teams were just begging the other team to win. I mean, there's giving up big time plays, and these aren't like big time play offenses. And we saw that with the Commanders when they faced a tougher defense in the Bills. But with Miami, I mean, a Chen, the running back, I mean, how spectacular is that dude? And listen, when you're a guy like on one side of the ball, like Mike McDaniel, and you have it, configured the way that you want schematically, like putting all these pieces around each other, and you get a player in the third round, I believe it was, and you have that kind of reaction in the draft room, like that should tell everybody what is coming. And I don't know if to your point, Omar, like, I don't think anybody was expecting a 70-point outburst like this. By the way, how bad are the Broncos? I mean, they just look completely defeated. Like in the third and fourth quarter, I was just like, they just wanted to be out of that stadium on their way back to Denver. But no, I just think that this offense, this is an offensive line. If you can get an average level of play with the way that Tua manages himself back there, the way that he kind of runs this offense, you're going to have a lot of success, and you're going to put a lot of teams behind early in games. And that's where they want to play. That's where the Bills want to play too.
Yeah. Speaking of the offensive line, I believe that the Dolphins would have a little bit of gripe in regards to the Buffalo Bills defensive line, because they've been the team that's hurt Tua for the last 2 years. Epinesa basically breaks Tua's ribs in the 2021 season. And then we go last year, Matt Milano, who basically dribbles Tua's head. How much do you think that trench play battle and that war at the line of scrimmage is going to be a factor in this game?
It's huge. It's the matchup in this game. I think if the Bills, I think their offense can score on the Dolphins. But if you get down by a couple scores and this turns into Josh Allen's got to put the team on his back type situation, we've seen as recently as a couple of weeks ago that not go well for this team. And I think the way that he is kind of reset himself after that first game, and we saw him on the sideline, and it was like this blank stare, like we've seen over the years in a couple of different spots. And it almost like 2 days later on that Wednesday press conference, it was flushed. He was focused, and he's played the kind of style that Ken Dorsey, Sean McDermott, Brian Daboll before them need him to play. But I just think that this Miami offense puts so much pressure on you. And I think that defensive line for the Bills, I think they have options, right? So you've seen early this season, I mean, last week against Sam Howell, everybody on their starting defensive line had 5 or more pressures. They sacked him 9 times. They're going to put pressure, but against Tua, it's different. Like, of course you want to try to hit him. Like you mentioned, Matt Milano, AJ Epinesa, who's coming off of maybe the game of his career with an interception, return for a touchdown and a sack. You have to get your hands up. And that's where I feel like the Bills defense is great. Little bit of a tidbit here. I wonder if the Bills flip Greg Rousseau out of Miami inside a little bit more this week because of his size at 6'8", trying to get into the passing and throwing lanes to kind of muck things up a little bit for Tua, because a lot of times you're not going to get to him. So you have to somehow affect the throwing lanes as best you can. And you could do all that and still get burned, as we've seen.
Yeah, I mean, I want to bring up something because you mentioned Josh Allen, and to me, it's a fine line with him looking from Miami. And I'm going to go back to the last 2 games last year between the Dolphins and the Bills, and I'm going to tell you that Saturday night game, Josh Allen wins that game. If it wasn't the case of Josh Allen does everything, I'm not sure the Bills win that game. And then in the playoffs, the Dolphins hung in because Josh Allen was really, really, really sloppy with the ball, and the Dolphins got a lot of takeaways and were able to score 31 points despite their offense being, as Omar likes to say, booty cheeks. So again, yeah, it's a fine line where he has to be like Superman, but not fly into a building, if you catch my drift. My question to you is, since you're saying that the Dolphins are who you thought they were, are the Bills right now, who some of the people who had him pegged as a major Super Bowl contender, back to that team right now? Oh, I had him there too. I thought the talk of like, well, look at the way they ended last year. They're ready to take a step back. I wasn't in that camp personally. Was I wrong in thinking, are they back to like Super Bowl contention level?
Yeah, I'm with you. I wasn't there either. I mean, their roster's deeper. Their offensive line is better. And we've seen that last week was the perfect kind of litmus test for the work they did going out and drafting Osiris Torrance, signing Connor McGovern, who was kind of an under the radar signing, but was one of the top rated pass blockers in the free agent class last year, and he's come in this season and he's been as good as anybody on that offensive line. Deion Dawkins has kind of flipped back to the Pro Bowl caliber that we saw late in the 2021 season. To me, that's huge. I mean, Josh Allen's gonna, minimize your deficiencies on the offensive line a lot of the time because of the way that he navigates the pocket, his ability to get to the second and third level. But there were times last year, like the injury when he suffered the elbow injury, that was a breakdown on the right side of the offensive line that just was happening too consistently last year. They're deeper at safety. If Micah Hyde or Jordan Poyer goes down, having a Taylor Rapp who's played in a Super Bowl, started 48 games, that's huge. They put DeMar Hamlin in a spot last year to play 900 plus snaps as a 6th rounder the year before. Really nice young player. There were some good things that he did last year, but there were also some games against some of the better offenses where I felt like he struggled out of position a little bit. Now you can kind of go to Rapp in that spot. And then Terrell Bernard is kind of a revelation here in week 3. There was a lot of question marks about Tremaine Edmonds going to Chicago. Bernard didn't play all of the preseason. They still went with him into the year. And already 2 interceptions through 3 games. Tremaine Edmonds in his first season has been a linebacker, had 2 picks his entire rookie season. So if this is a real upgrade maybe in coverage, as crazy as that sounds, because across the league, Edmonds is thought of as an elite linebacker, but at times, like some of the coverage issues, especially in games against like Miami, Kansas City when Hill was there, I thought Tremaine Edmonds had some of his worst games. And I think Bernard instinctually as a coverage player is an upgrade over him. While he may not be the better player, I think he matches up better because of his size and short area quickness and his ability to play that zone scheme and affect passing games in coverage. We saw it last week.
I wanted to follow up on Josh Allen because I began this process as not a believer. Then when he cleaned up his game under Brian Daboll, I was like, man, this guy is going to be a force. But there's also the hero ball element. Yeah. And there's also I'm a large quarterback. I'm a 6'5", 240-pound quarterback. I'm going to run over your defender. At a certain point, there's a delineating line of return where you can't handle that kind of physicality as a quarterback and stay healthy in the NFL. How much have you seen him try to harness that back? I know he said he wanted to stop doing it, but how much has he really stopped doing it?
Can I chime in real quick? I saw a clip of him sliding at the end of a scramble against Washington, and in the post-game press conference, he turned around with a smile on his face, going like, "Some people owe me some money here."
Yes. Well, I was going to say there's 2 parts to this, because there's the last couple of games, I just think he's relied more on his arm. And so if you take the running part of it out and you're able to attack teams with your arm, which he should be able to, I mean, he's able to make every throw on the field. I think sometimes he doesn't trust his teammates enough to get open. And part of that is, I think, warranted. I mean, beyond Stefan Diggs, there hasn't been a lot of reliability in his pass catching crew. I mean, Gabe Davis, for as high as I am on him this year, he's had some drop issues. Last year he led the team in drops. He had a big drop last week on a first down that would have given him a first down. They ended up having a punt. It didn't matter. It was a blowout, but little things like that. And then you go back to week 1 where he's on 3rd down running and he's 4 or 5 yards short of a first down. He tries to hurdle a guy and ends up taking a huge hit on the end of the hurdle. It's he just short circuits in those moments. He goes back to his high school days or middle school days when he was playing in the backyard, and he was just. And what's funny, back then he wasn't even bigger than everybody. He had his growth spurt in college, but he plays with that just linebacker, tight end,
reckless abandonment.
Yeah, yes, and he's got to chill with it. I think a lot of times we've seen some of that the last 2 weeks, where I just think and it's partly a Dorsey too. He's got to put him in a position where he doesn't feel that. So it means managing him in game. How is he calling in the plays? He's talked about getting on the headset when he's calling his play and being as calm as possible to try to bring down the sugar high, if you will, because people talked about that with Allen over the course of his career. And they got to do that. And if Miami goes up in this game, how much pressure does he feel to then lead them back? And to your earlier point, Alan, he's done it before. Like he can do it. It's just, is that the best way to consistently operate the offense? I don't think the Bills believe that to be the case, but at the same time, it's like, you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't. You don't want to coach out the greatness from the player. You just got to ask him to be smarter in certain spots.
We know there's been a lot of publicity, a lot of talk about the relationship between him and Stefan Diggs. So where does it stand from where you sit?
No, I definitely think that there was real waves at the end of last season. I think it's been a little bit overblown, especially some of the national stuff since June. And of course, that was like kind of perpetrated by Sean McDermott when minicamp came around, and he was the first one to say, well, he's very concerned over Diggs not being there. Meanwhile, didn't think to mention that he just went home like a few minutes before that press conference, like an important detail there that like spiraled this thing out of control. And when we talked to Alan, even later that day, he said they were having good, productive conversations that morning. And it's led them back to a point where I think Diggs knows that, like, sometimes the devil you know is better than the devil you don't. And there's say in a world where he could be traded, which they don't live in that world, because I mean, he's under contract for the next 2 seasons. The dead money is insane. There's no way to get out of that. Where are you going to trade him? Are the Bills going to trade him to a place he wants to go with a great quarterback and a great, probably not. So it's like lean in. I think he's landed at a place where he's leaning into this year. He's voiced his concerns with the way that the offense kind of fell off its tracks. And through 3 games, he has been the focal point of the offense. They have moved the ball. They have developed some bit of a run game. We'll see. When you go up against the Miami Dolphins, it's like, that's a run game. And so like what the Bills have done, they've done a lot of their damage late in the game because the passing game has been good, and they haven't faced good teams the last couple of weeks. So yeah, I think things are good for now, but there was definitely some problems. And if the Bills offense struggles at any point, do those things kind of bubble back up? I mean, everybody will be watching for it.
Speaking of wide receivers, you have one of our former wide receivers in Trent Sherfield there. What kind of level of contribution have you seen from him in the first 3 games?
Interestingly enough, not a lot of snaps the first 2 weeks. And then last week, we saw a pretty significant dip for Gabe Davis. I think he went from 90 plus, which he was at about 90 last season throughout the whole season, down to about low 70s. And Sherfield went from like a 15 to 20% up to 45. And I think they want to get him on the field more in running situations. I mean, he's one of the best pass or run blocking receivers in the NFL. So
serve the same purpose here.
What's that?
I said serve the same purpose here. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I think they want to put him in that spot a little bit more. And I also think that like he's the kind of guy that can be a nice safety valve for Josh. I mean, he plays all 3 spots. They worked him in during training camp and preseason at those spots, but there's a little bit of like a muddled like group at that third wide receiver. You have Khalil Shakir, who they drafted in the 5th round last year, who they made a big touchdown catch 2 weeks ago. Then you have Deontay Hardy, who of the group, he's making almost $5 million. They paid him to be like the 3rd wide receiver, but they're not really using him that way. And then you have Sherfield, who I think can do everything and arguably is the most valuable of the 3. So they're trying to figure out where all those guys fit in around Diggs and Davis. Dawson Knox, who's the $12.5 million tight end. And oh, by the way, they traded up to draft a 1st round tight end in Dalton Kincaid, who hasn't really gotten his footing yet. But to me, that is another matchup that I'm really watching this week. Kincaid hasn't been relied upon too much in the first 3 games. And I wonder if the Bills pivot, maybe even not so much in 12 personnel, but 11 personnel against a Miami team that likes to play a lot of nickel. That's where I think Dalton Kincaid can maybe give you some advantages in the passing game because of his size, quickness, fluidity as a route runner. But they haven't leaned into that too much yet. He's a rookie. Sean McDermott, tends to be a little bit slow in bringing rookies along. So we'll see if that could be a matchup they can exploit.
Yeah, and see, to me, I look at the matchup of Dolphin defense versus Bill offense. And from the Dolphin standpoint, the matchup that looks very favorable to me is Jalen Phillips. If he plays, he's got an oblique injury. We don't know status. We're assuming he plays, or even whoever lines up at that spot against Spencer Brown, who to me, every time I've seen him, I've come away, how shall I put this delicately, massively unimpressed.
No, I think that's totally fair. I mean, he was coming in this season, and I think we had 4 or 5 press availabilities with Brandon Beane this offseason. And every single time one of us said, what is the deal with Spencer Brown? And why are you guys just rolling back with the same plan. They brought no competition in for this guy. So there's a belief in the building in him. And now we've seen things over the first 3 weeks that I think are encouraging. I'm not going to say that he's played a great game. They're giving him a lot of help. Against Max Crosby, he was one of the main talking points out of that week because Crosby was just held pretty much ineffective. That was his main matchup. Now, they were giving him a lot of help, but there were some one-on-ones that he won, which I think from a confidence building perspective, that's a place to start. But to your point, I think Jalen Phillips is even a different kind of player than Max Crosby, more athletic. I think is going to put a little bit more pressure on Brown with some of his speed on the edge, the way that he bends a little bit. And I think that's definitely a matchup to watch because when the Bills' offensive line has faltered early this season, it's been Spencer Brown for the most part that's been involved. So, yeah, I'm looking at Phillips and even, geez, man, that maniac Van Ginkel, who looked like an absolute menace a couple of weeks ago. That is a nice depth piece to have, somebody that really offers some fire off the edge.
Yeah, and also I want to touch on the big matchup, which seems to be sort of a beef issue with Miami Dolphins defensive tackle Christian Wilkins and Deion Dawkins, who basically said, "Yeah, I don't like that guy." And then we've got the grab incident with Josh Allen, which obviously Bills fans have a little bit of an issue with. How much do you think Christian will be a problem or a matchup or a key focal point for this Bills offensive line?
Huge. And like the Bills, you need these kinds of things in these rivalries, though, right? Like two guys that don't like each other, and Dawkins and Wilkins, fine. Allen kind of just doesn't like Wilkins, and Wilkins doesn't like Allen. I mean, that's the way it's supposed to be. I mean,
if you hear Wilkins, he loves Allen.
Oh,
yeah,
really?
They're buddies.
That's what he said.
Yeah.
That's what he said yesterday.
We're buddies. Yeah.
Dude, I tried explaining to my son, who's 9 years old. I introduced him to Brian Cox last year, and some of those games where he would come into the stadium, he'd be flipping birds, people be throwing batteries down at him. Like that was a different era of like NFL football and just society at large, things that were allowed back then. But like that's the good stuff. And I think from a player perspective, Wilkins is such a good matchup for them because the interior, as good as McGovern has been as a pass blocker, and we'll see, like this is going to be one of the tests. Because I think Wilkins raises his level, which is already super high when he plays against the Bills. He's had some of his best games against the Bills. You go back and watch last season, the pressures are there. I think he had a couple sacks. Like he plays well against this team, and they've traditionally struggled against some of those elite, bigger, athletic interior three tech. So I'm watching that matchup very closely. I think that could be a problem because I think they've created a really nice, safe place for Allen in the middle of that pocket early in the season that Wilkins can kind of blow up if you let him. So yeah, that's fun. I can't wait to watch that one.
It'd be nice for Christian to have a breakout game in search of this big new contract that he wants, because so far this season he's been okay, but he hasn't been nearly, I think, as noticeable as he was last year. Am I right, Omar?
Yeah, he's been okay, but the biggest concern for me is Vic Fangio's defense. I'm not into this bend but don't break situation, and what's going to be interesting to see with Josh Allen is, does he put a spy on him? And I've been through a lot of Dolphins defensive coordinators, and the spy is the right approach to take with Josh Allen just because of his ability to scramble out of the pocket. Let me ask you about the running game. James Cook seems to be that lead back, but then you've also got Damian Harris and Latavius Murray. Have the Bills improved to the point where they have a respectable running game that you have to sort of pay attention to?
They have like more pitches than like, if they're a starting pitcher, like that was just leaning on the fastball in recent years. I mean, Devin Singletary, Zach Moss, Matt Breida, they were all the same style of runner. Now there's an off-speed pitch. You can bring Damian Harris out, who's more physical. Latavius Murray, who's just, I think part of his success, and I'm actually writing a big story on him this week, is just like his size, the way that he's so elusive and puts himself on you so quickly. But at that size, it's awkward. There's not a lot of running backs that come at you at 6'5" with that kind of short area quickness. And he's 33, but it's like, he's not slowing down. Like he's as good as he's been. I mean, I think he leads the Bills in rushing touchdowns through the first 3 games. But Cook as the premier guy, I was listening to, I think it was Nate Tice maybe, was talking about looking at the film on Cook through 3 games. And he said he's not comparing him to Tyreek Hill because there's no Tyreek Hills, but there's
a part to his game where there's guys in the league where if you're turning a corner, right, you're going to have to stop for even just a bit of like a moment, a half second, and then change directions and go upfield. That's what makes Hill special, is that he's almost full speed around corners. Cook has that to his game. There's a fluidity to when he gets to the outside to where he doesn't slow down. And all of a sudden he's around that outside defender and upfield. And that's led to like 7 or 8 extra yards on runs pretty consistently throughout the first few games of the season. So I like where they're at with Cook. I think that they can put him in a little bit better spot in terms of getting him more involved in the first half. But also, I got to credit Ken Dorsey for, okay, Cook's not having great success in the first or second series. Let's go to the off-speed stuff, bring in Murray, let him have a couple of 5-6 yard runs. And that's helped this offense get out of some early issues they've had the first couple of weeks.
I want to ask you a little bit about the defensive line, because it's, in my opinion, one of the deepest defensive lines in the NFL, where you basically go 2 units deep with backups like Tim Settle and my best friend, Jordan Phillips.
I was going to mention that.
You don't know our history together. Shaq Lawson, AJ Epinesa. I mean, do they rotate those guys, or are they particularly specific scheme-specific players?
They do rotate pretty heavily. You're going to see a steady stream of Rousseau, Floyd. Those are the starters on the edge. And then Ed Oliver and Daquan Jones, who are heavy snap count at the top of the interior players. Oliver's been outstanding through the first 3 games. This has been arguably his greatest 3-game stretch as a Bill. Like, the big knock on him has been the inconsistency. If he's going to play at this level for 17 games, this now turns into a legitimate top 3 defensive line, because we're talking about the success that they've had, the 15 quarterback hits, the 20 plus pressures last week, the 9 sacks against the Commanders, which have a bad offensive line, but you got to do that against the bad offensive lines. They don't have Von Miller yet. They're going to get him back sometime early October, late October, maybe even hold him out until November if you want. They need him in December and January, but like, it's deep. It's really good on the interior, and Phillips is in a spot now where he can just be the pin your ears back, rushing the passer a lot of times on 3rd down. And that's where he's thrived in this defense over the years. Settle's really good. They brought over Poona Ford, who I feel like hasn't really assimilated into things as much yet. He was a healthy scratch this past week. He's kind of just behind the 8 ball. And it took Settle actually a year in the system to where he felt really comfortable. And then Lawson, it's like, this is where he thrives. Like, he with Sean McDermott, Eric Washington, he had 6 pressures last week, and he's not even really a bona fide pass rusher. He's more of an edge set and defender.
We had him here in Miami, and it just didn't fit. It
right.
wasn't what we expected it to be. I believe we traded him to Buffalo.
Traded him to
Houston for Bernard McKinney.
And then they cut him, and he signed with the Jets. Yeah. They cut him, and then he came back to Buffalo. And late last season, he was the top snap percentage defensive end after Von Miller went out, ahead of Rousseau, ahead of Basham, the 2nd rounder, Epinesa. So they rely on him quite a bit. And then they have this young kid, Kingsley Jonathan, the UDFA out of Syracuse. Hasn't made a ton of a big splash this year yet, but they love what he's brought. And he's a little bit more of the Von kind of pass rusher, the bendability, ability to get outside, more of that traditional outside linebacker style. I'm not sure if you'll see him, but they played him this last week against Washington. He had a quarterback hit, so we'll see if he gets any more action. But Epinesa is playing really well, and he likes playing the Dolphins.
Yeah, the Dolphins badly overpaid for Lawson when they signed him here, and he was a bad scheme fit like from the start. My question to you regarding the Bills defense, with Sean McDermott now calling the shots instead of Leslie Frazier, are we going to notice anything stylistically different in terms of what they do?
This week's going to be a really good test, because they've given the job to Christian Benford at cornerback 2, who just fit more into what they asked their corners to do, like play off the majority of the time in that zone scheme. Kyer Elam, who they drafted in the 1st round last year, he played predominantly press at Florida. And I think, to be honest with you, this is the kind of matchup against the Dolphins where I'd bring him back into the mix, even on a snap share type of situation with Benford. Benford was 1-on-1 last week against Curtis Samuel and got burned pretty badly, but he's really reliable. He's a great tackler, which you have to be against this team. So they're going to want him on the field. But I think they might like to mix in Elam a little bit. He played pretty well against the Dolphins last year. Had that one interception. I can't remember which game it was, but he was good. But I think McDermott just having, like, when it's your defense, right, that you're asking someone else to run, like he did with Leslie all those years, and they had so much success. I think sometimes there's just too many cooks in the kitchen. And I think just taking it back, because it is your defense, and at times he took play calling over when Leslie was here, just owning it and running that side of the ball, like Sean McVay does on the offense for the Rams, and then letting Dorsey handle everything on offense. As long as the game management stuff doesn't take a hit, which it hasn't so far, it just looks like they're more in sync. He really trusts Bernard. Matt Milano is another guy that's really good. And they're finally healthy in their secondary. They have White back, Hyde back, Poyer back, all three healthy, which is important too. And we've talked about the defensive line. So I think it's just more about, like, all right, there's no middleman. It's coming right from McDermott. He kind of wield this thing a little bit more as his own defense.
Now, can they play good man-to-man? Because I feel like there's a strategy where if you're going to play zone against Miami, we're just going to go over the top of it and pick you apart slowly. Either we're going to pick you apart laterally or pick you apart vertically. So you pick which one you want to do. Have they been good at man-to-man?
Not traditionally. And I actually think that Tre'Davious, they play some man, but like Tre'Davious White, especially like coming off of the ACL 2 years ago, like, he's not as quick. He's not as reactive. He had a really nice interception last week where he kind of read the play and leaned on some of those instincts. But, across their secondary, there's not a lot of speed. Like, Hyde is so, like, he's played so much football, and he was a nickel early in his career. So, like, he covers a lot of ground. Like, we've seen some of these highlight reel plays, the Patriots interception a couple years ago where he comes flying across the field. Like, he can be dangerous in that role. He had a pick last week. But I don't think, that they're going to more so, I think, rely on, passing guys off, playing their zones, trying to get to the football. That's a dangerous game to play. And then you're just going to kind of rely on your own offense to outscore.
Yeah.
Which,
if you, I don't know how you play that game with Miami, especially if they get Jalen Waddle back. They've just shown that they can carve zones up, but best of luck to them.
I think it comes down to like the pass rush. Like, are they hitting Tua? Like, that changes the dynamic of things. Like, that's what they're kind of, that's why they built up this defensive line that they have. I mean, obviously Mahomes was the impetus for it early on, but Tua, the same kind of situation. If he sits back there and is able to get, I think I saw the 2.7 time to throw last week. I think he was hit once, pressured 4 times. Like, you're not going to win against them. Like, you have to at least be back there and be affecting him, whether or not you play zone or man. And so to me, that's where I think the Bills are going to lean on this. Like, and you might see a more, like, another kind of side stat to this. The Bills have been one of the least blitzing teams, at least last week, maybe all 3 weeks early in the season, which was a surprise because a lot of people thought McDermott would be more aggressive blitzing. Maybe he brings out some more different looks, different blitz looks this week. Matt Milano's a good blitzer. Bernard is supposed to be a good blitzer, and so are like Taron Johnson and Poyer. So we'll see if they do that more.
Last thing from us here. If you're comfortable making a prediction, go for it. If you don't want to make a prediction, any sense of how this game plays out?
I'm not. Don't make that man make a prediction.
I'm offering him the opportunity because I'm sure Dolphin fans want to know, does the guy in Buffalo think that the Bills are going to win like a typical homer from Buffalo, or is he going to be realistic and know that the Dolphins are going to kick their ass? I'm just kidding. But I am curious from, again, we're in entrenched in South Florida here. I'm curious as the view from Rochester, any vague idea of how the game plays out?
I don't have my prediction locked in yet, but I think this is going to be a high scoring game. I think it's going to probably be the winner is going to be in the 40s. And that's, I say that thinking that I think the Bills defense is going to be able to turn the ball over a little bit. They're an opportunistic, experienced defense that, while they're probably not going to ring up the sacks against Tua in this offensive line, I think they're going to do enough to affect things. And to me, that's a sneaky key in this game. Last week, that game went off the tracks because, I mean, the Broncos had a couple decent drives early, but they kept turning the ball over. And it's like, you turn the ball over against this team, you're dead because they're just going to score too many points. I'm leaning Miami right now, to be honest with you. I mean, they're just playing so well and they're so in sync. And you mentioned Omar getting Jalen back, but I reserve judgment. I want to be in the locker room this week. I want to get a feel for Buffalo, how they're approaching this matchup. That will kind of, and I even told my producer at
Matt, I apologize. We're about to get the recording's about to stop here. You You said you're picking Miami, so we're going to hold you to that. And on that note, we thank you so much for joining us. Find us on YouTube, of course, on the Fans First Sports Network under Miami Dolphins Insider on alldolphins.com. We'll be back here tomorrow. Thanks, everyone.
Tell the people where to find Matt.
Sorry, Matt is on the Shout podcast, and you're also on Syracuse.com. Thanks, everyone.